You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
Hello and welcome, or welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. One of the themes that comes up in this podcast often is the power of curiosity, of using our practice as an opportunity to explore and noticing what comes up for us as individuals. Well, this theme came out in episode 54, all about the hip labrum. Tiffany and I were discussing the most helpful yoga practices post-physical therapy for a hip labral injury. And these also turned out to be really generally helpful practices for hip health and durability for all of us. Let's listen into this conversation to learn more. And of course, if you want a deeper dive, consider joining us in the 55-hour online yoga medicine hip training, or depending on when you're watching and listening, the 50-hour in-person training coming up in Bali this October. We rejoin our conversation from episode 54 as Tiffany and I are discussing the impact our postural habits can have on our hip health, including one postural pattern commonly called lower cross syndrome, characterized by weak or inhibited abdominals and glutes, and tight or chronically shortened hip flexors and erector spinae. Let's listen in. So really what you're leading into here is what you alluded to earlier, is what are the biomechanical patterns that created this issue in the first place? And unless you did have some acute or chronic traumatic issue and you're in the bucket of it being more long-term,
exactly.
something led to this damage over time. And so even once you've finished your prescribed medical treatment, there's a reasonable chance those biomechanical patterns still remain. And that's one great example that we see in people all the time.
Yeah, that's the perfect summary. And that can be, again, as a way to prevent surgery sometimes for minor issues. Like I said, a lot of times they'll send them to physical therapy to see how they respond, or post-surgical, again, if it's a chronic issue, there's usually biomechanical issues. Now, if you've done like the hip module with us, we train our students, our teachers, to take them through a full evaluation. And I would focus on whatever's standing out, as being tight and limited range of motion, restoring range of motion, and also strength of the tissues. So really, I'm just looking for challenges, but we know that this lower cross syndrome predisposes to some increased pressure on the anterior labrum, that weak part, because of the anterior tilting of the pelvis associated with it. So, that's just an easy one to look at if we're not talking about a specific individual in front of us. So working on the glutes, hip extension stuff, really great. You'll see, like, if you do our yoga medicine online, I've got a lot of stuff where we do hip extension, but I'm also trying to almost round the lower back, because a lot of times people will compensate, especially these lower cross syndrome people who have tight erectors too. They compensate by just laying in the lower back. So I'm almost like rounding my lower back or pushing my lumbar spine back. Really exaggerating in the abdominals to get to those. I know you've got a bunch of those classes too with that, Rachel. I mean, bird dog's such a great one.
Coincidentally, all of these things have been incredibly helpful in my own body to overcome the imbalances that I have. So yeah, glute max, especially the lower portion, for sure. Glute med, you mentioned as being this really potent hip stabilizer, really important. And I think not getting too hung up on the details, but as you said, looking for the things that stand out. What's really easy? What's really difficult? What feels limited? Where are there big differences between the side that I have pain and the other side? Or even if I don't have pain, what really stands out between the two sides? That kind of investigation to me is what makes yoga so powerful compared to lots of other things that we could do.
And I think, like even just lower cross syndrome, not that this is, it's one generality, but it is really applicable to a lot of people, especially people who sit a lot. They sit on that glute maximus.
It's a stereotype
tends
for a
to
reason,
inhibit it. The belly softens, the psoas tightens. It's a common theme. It's not the cure-all. It's not the only thing, but looking all around that hip joint to find ways to balance both range of motion and strength. I think one of the interesting things here is just looking for what's challenging. I know I have a bunch of these on Yoga Medicine Online. I have one called 3D Hip Strength, where we actually look all around the hip joint, and it helps people also find what's limited for them. I have one that's called Release and Mobilize the Hips, where you can look for the mobility deficits too. So that as a yoga student, what I love about our site online too is really helping people investigate and find these things maybe preventatively, and not freak out. I don't need to be afraid of these things, but be able to like appreciate the challenges, whether that's a strength challenge or mobility challenge. And I think a lot of people can benefit from working on glute med and glute max and
100%. And lower abdominals and getting their psoas strong in a lengthened position and not just in a shortened position. Yeah, these things are a stereotype for a reason. Yeah, and I agree. And I also use myofascial release for that. I have a class that is a 360-degree exploration using myofascial release so that you can feel from the inside. Is the quality of those tissues different? Is the intensity of sensation different? And to me, that's a really easy place to start. If you're not feeling fired up enough to do strength challenges in all directions, lie on a ball in different orientations and gather information that way.
Yeah. And I think you don't need to be on our platform to, experiment with these things, but looking at the different movements of the hip, how do I challenge hip flexion and hip extension and abduction and adduction and internal and external rotation, if you're familiar with those. I mean, I know that we have a lot of teachers who listen. So, you can kind of run with that information. For students who are listening, you might want specific guided classes. But I find also really important is active loading and rotation, which we do some, like just in warrior poses, we're loading all of our body weight on top of that externally rotated front leg. But we rarely load internal rotation. And so I love some of those classes I mentioned. Like I've got one called Hip Strength in 20, where we actually just put ankle weights on and do it, which is just an easy way to get really specific. But strengthening that active control of rotation is really important. I've found to be one of the, besides just the glutes and eccentric psoas work, probably one of the key things that I do with the people I work with who have labral issues, and especially the ones who end up not having to go to surgery. Again, it's not a cure-all. Some people need surgery, but being able to work through active internal and external rotation, which we do a lot on our site, we do a lot in our training. And if you're a teacher, you might be able to figure that out on your own too. It's hard in an audio podcast. I know some people watch the video.
To describe all this stuff. No, I agree. I tend to start with the big picture, sort of what stands out as being challenging, what stands out as being easy, where there are big differences between the two sides. But you're right. I feel like the more functional the person, the more I tend to get into loaded rotation, because it seems to be something that as we lose that, or if we lose that, we start to compensate in other areas. And if you can kind of peel back the static and get to that level of information, that can be a game changer for people who don't have big standouts in, they don't have super weak glutes or they don't have super tight psoas, but rotation can be just nuanced enough of a challenge to highlight where they might have been able to compensate and kind of hide it from themselves even.
Yeah. And I think if you can unload that, like I was talking about the class with the ankle weights, that hip strength in 20, like if you can unload it and put ankle weights on it, I think a lot of this is on the ground. It makes it really accessible.
Even for me,
I'll
no
use
ankle weights, just rotating my own leg weight is enough of a challenge for me to find my weak points.
But even like I'll oftentimes use it right away with people with labral issues, because it does make it really accessible. So it doesn't have to be like the full body weight of Warrior 2, which even a lot of people who have labral tears can still do all that stuff. Like I see it all the time, which is another topic we need to tap into in a moment. But like, it's really common in the yoga world. But I think some of the interesting things, like working with the glutes, doesn't necessarily have to be class specific. We have a lot of those, and that's great. But like, think about just going through your regular flow class and activating right around the sitting bone, which is the part of the glute max that tends to get really weak, the part that we sit on right around the sitting bone there, really activating that all through the class. So it's like the first thing to get tired, so that maybe you're even sore there, like in a good way the next day. And if you can just use that, I find that can be really helpful. I'll often tell people that if they like come up to me at the beginning of a group class. I love the eccentric psoas work you were talking about too, Rachel. Like, so imagine you're on your back, you grab a block or a foam roller, you put it under your sacrum, not your low back, and then you hug one knee in towards your chest and extend the other one up, keep it straight, and just slowly lower it down to a hover and just pulse there. Your leg is straight and you're not putting the foot on the floor, but you're just kind of hovering there. So I'm eccentrically engaging is so helpful, because I think the psoas is, for a lot of people, not just tight, but a lot of people is weak. And this eccentric training is such a nice active way to lengthen it. Especially for people
that's
who
what
are
I use it for. It doesn't, to me, in my body, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like refreshment. That, it's been in a shortened position for such a long period of time. This is just like, I get to stretch out. I get to glide. I'm being my own psoas here. I get to glide between me and the neighboring structures. I get some blood flow. Oh, this is amazing. So yeah, for me, after sitting, for example, after traveling, even though we are making the muscle work, it feels like refreshment to me.
I'm feeling like I'm probably going to do this when we get off. Yeah, it is such a good one, and
lower glute max is getting a little tender right now just from thinking about it as I sit here.
But it's also nice because it takes the low back out of the equation and really focuses it into that hip flexor there. So,
and that's why the bent knee in towards you is so crucial, because the bent knee coming in towards you really encourages your pelvis to tip backwards and your low back to flatten or round a little bit. So
I know
that's the important
some
part.
Nuances, all the nuances, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that active lengthening of the psoas is such a great one. I mean, using the MFR on the back is a great one. Active rotation. The other thing you and I were talking about actually before this is, also being careful with loaded internal rotation. So there is one time we do loaded internal rotation. I said it rarely happens, but the one time we do tend to do this is transitioning from something like half moon into standing splits or into Digasana, where I am going from an externally rotated position on that standing leg to more of an internal rotation position, which has the possibility of then putting more shearing force into the labrum as I close off the joint in that internal rotation. And so we were talking about the controversy of this, like there's always this question of like, is it good or is it bad? Well, it really just depends. If I'm tired, I think the problem is a lot of teachers cue this at the end of a long sequence as a challenge, right? And then you're like standing splits. You just kind of lay and fall into it.
Thank God I can let all my muscles go and just hang out.
But if I can stick with it just a little bit longer and slowly control that, I get to learn new information, strength, and control of the joint, which is really valuable in the right circumstances. However, if I'm just like flopping into it and laying into it over and over again, and that's something I commonly do, it could definitely irritate. Not that I need to be afraid of it.
It's like anything, isn't it? There's no really easy answer of it's always bad or it's always perfectly safe. The nitty gritty's in the middle, isn't it? It can be perfectly safe. It can be something that you do and feel completely fine. But you could also be tired. You could also be at your end range of motion. You could be also trying to square the hips, which is often what I'm trying to do in Warrior 3 or in a standing split, so that I get the glute work for the lifted leg as opposed to just turning my pelvis to make it easier to lift the leg higher. And all of those things could be the right amount of challenge or too much challenge, depending on the person, the day, the mood, your level of hydration, your hormone levels, your stress levels, your diet, all the things.
And so I think it's just relishing those challenges and knowing that we learn, we live and we learn, and our bodies respond and adapt. And knowing that, I think just being conscious of controlling that and going slowly. And again, if you just kind of embrace that challenge in all the ways, I think you'll naturally do that. I mentioned a bunch of classes. I did create a little playlist before this for those who are already on our site. It's called, so if you go to Yoga Medicine Online and click on my page and there's a playlist called All About the Hips. And I've got all of those in there. And even if you don't have labral tears or issues there, it's not like made to be a labral tear rehab program, but a lot of investigation around mobility and stability and strength that can also be just about making your hips more powerful and capable, and maybe a little like protective component to it.
Yeah. We'll link to that playlist in the show notes. And I think if you're going into your practice with that sort of investigative hat on, having pen and paper, notepad and pen, or notes on your phone, if you're more technologically advanced than I am, that can be such a helpful thing, because maybe today you are a little tired or you are a little dehydrated, but if you repeat that and you still find it challenging, and next time that starts to become useful information that you can gather about yourself. So don't hesitate to not just be guided through the process, but also to be a really active participant in noticing where the challenges stand out, where there are differences between the two sides, and retaining that information so that you remember it when the practice is finished.
And I think, I mean, it depends on the person and circumstance. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be taking notes along the way, but the big standout things, those will, you might need to take notes along the way a little bit, because then you might be like, was that right or was that left? Or
yeah, for me, by the time I come out of Shavasana, the whole class is just a complete blur. So it's like, what did we even do? But you're absolutely right. People can get too nitty gritty in the details and drive themselves crazy. You're right. You're looking for the things that really do stand out. You just want to remember this position or this leg. And other than that, you don't need to go too crazy.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.